One line, 7 words. And in less than 10 seconds, a freshman state representative from Queens completely dismantled a seasoned Congresswoman's entire argument and possibly her political future. What you're about to witness isn't just a political comeback. It's a masterclass in how to respond to discrimination with such surgical precision that it leaves your opponent speechless and makes you a viral sensation overnight. Nancy Mace thought she was dealing with just another young politician. She could intimidate with condescension and barely veiled racism. She had no idea she was about to face someone who had been preparing for that exact moment her entire life. The response that came next was so perfectly crafted, so devastatingly effective, that political analysts are calling it the most powerful 7 words in modern American politics. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why those 7 words have been viewed over 50 million times and turned Zohran Mamdani into a political phenomenon. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. If Zohran had hesitated for even 3 seconds, the moment would have been lost. Nancy Mace's dismissive comment would have stood unchallenged, and we'd be talking about a completely different story today. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. Picture this: a packed committee hearing room at Albany, New York, the kind of sterile, fluorescent-lit government space where careers are made and destroyed, often in the span of a single exchange. It's a joint committee hearing on housing policy, not exactly the stuff of viral videos. The room is filled with the usual suspects: seasoned politicians, policy wonks, and a handful of reporters who are probably checking their phones and wondering when they can grab lunch. But today is different. Today, Nancy Mace has made the trip up from South Carolina as a guest witness, invited to share her expertise on federal housing initiatives. She's feeling confident, maybe even a little cocky. After all, she's a congresswoman talking to a room full of state legislators. In her mind, she's the big fish in a small pond. What she doesn't realize is that she's about to encounter someone who refuses to be talked down to, dismissed, or treated as anything less than an equal. Someone who has spent years perfecting the art of standing up to bullies with intelligence, grace, and devastating effectiveness. The cameras are rolling for what everyone assumes will be routine C-SPAN footage. Nobody in that room has any idea they're about to witness a moment that will be dissected, analyzed, and celebrated across social media for months to come. But to understand why what happened next was so powerful, you need to understand who these two people really are. Because this wasn't just a random political confrontation. It was the collision of 2 completely different worldviews, 2 different generations, and 2 very different ideas about what American politics should be. Let me tell you about Zohran Mamdani, because his story is unlike any other politician in America today. Born in Uganda to South Asian parents, Zohran's family immigrated to the United States when he was just 2 years old. They settled in Queens, not the gentrified parts you see in movies, but the real Queens, where immigrant families work multiple jobs and every dollar counts. His parents weren't wealthy. His father drove a taxi while studying for his engineering degree. His mother cleaned offices at night while raising 3 kids during the day. They were the American dream personified, working multiple jobs, sacrificing everything, and believing that education and hard work would give their children opportunities they never had. But here's what shaped Zohran's worldview. He grew up watching his parents, highly educated, incredibly intelligent people, being treated as second-class citizens because of their accents, their skin color, and their immigrant status. He watched his father, who had been an engineer in Uganda, struggle to get his credentials recognized in America. He watched his mother, who spoke 4 languages fluently, be dismissed by people who could barely speak one. By the time Zohran got to high school, he had developed what his teachers called an attitude problem. He wouldn't back down when other students made racist jokes. He challenged teachers who made assumptions about immigrant families. He questioned authority in ways that made adults uncomfortable. But instead of getting into trouble, something interesting happened. His teachers started to realize that Zoran wasn't being disrespectful, he was being precise. When he challenged something, he came prepared with facts, data, and logical arguments that were hard to dismiss. He went on to study at Columbia, then got involved in local politics in Queens. But he never forgot those early lessons about standing up to people who try to dismiss you based on their assumptions about who you are or where you come from. By 2020, when he was elected to the New York State Assembly, Zohran had perfected something that would serve him well in the Albany hearing room: the ability to respond to condescension with intelligence, to meet dismissiveness with facts, and to turn someone's prejudices against them with surgical precision. Now, let's talk about Nancy Mace, because understanding her background is crucial to understanding why she made the mistake that would define this entire confrontation. Nancy Mace built her political career on being the reasonable Republican. She was the first woman to graduate from the Citadel Military College. She positioned herself as a moderate voice who could work across the aisle. She cultivated an image of professionalism and competence, but there was another side to Nancy Mace that her carefully crafted public image didn't always show. Those who worked with her described someone who had a tendency to talk down to people she perceived as beneath her station, someone who used her credentials and experience as weapons to intimidate younger or less experienced politicians. She had a particular way of dismissing ideas she disagreed with, not by engaging with the substance, but by questioning the credibility or experience of the person presenting them. It was a strategy that had worked well for her in South Carolina politics, where seniority and traditional power structures still held significant sway. The problem was that Nancy Mace had never encountered someone like Zohran Mamdani. She was used to dealing with politicians who would back down when challenged, who would defer to her congressional credentials, who would accept being talked down to rather than create a confrontation. When she walked into that Albany hearing room, she brought all of her assumptions, all of her usual tactics, and all of her confidence that her status as a congresswoman would automatically command respect and deference. She had no idea she was about to encounter someone who had spent his entire life preparing to respond to exactly the kind of dismissive, condescending treatment she was about to deliver. The hearing had been going on for about an hour when things started to get interesting. Various state representatives had asked Nancy Mace routine questions about federal housing policy, and she had given routine answers with the kind of polished confidence that comes from years of congressional hearings. But you could sense something shifting in the room when Zohran Mamdani was recognized to speak. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, confident but not deferential. Maybe it was the fact that he had clearly done his homework, with a folder full of research and statistics in front of him. Zohran started with a seemingly simple question about the effectiveness of federal housing voucher programs in areas with high immigrant populations. It was a technical question, the kind that usually generates boring, policy-heavy responses that put everyone to sleep. But Nancy Mace's response revealed something important about her mindset. Instead of engaging with the substance of the question, she launched into a lengthy explanation of her congressional experience, her committee assignments, and her credentials, as if Zoran's question wasn't worthy of a direct answer. You could see Zoran's expression change slightly. Not anger, not frustration, but something more calculating. Like he was recognizing a pattern he had seen many times before. He followed up with a more specific question about data, showing that immigrant families were being systematically excluded from certain housing programs. This time, his question included specific statistics, referenced particular studies, and demonstrated a level of preparation that should have commanded respect. Nancy. Mace's response was where everything went wrong. Instead of engaging with his data or acknowledging his research, she did something that revealed her true attitude toward Zohran and toward people like him. She was about to make the mistake that would define the rest of her political career. Happen Next took place in less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds contained enough political dynamite to fuel months of analysis and discussion. Zohran had just presented compelling evidence that federal housing policies were having discriminatory effects on immigrant communities. His data was solid, his presentation was professional, and his question was legitimate. Given this evidence, what specific steps is Congress taking to address these disparities? Nancy Mace's response started normally enough. She began with a usual political non-answer about looking into the issue and working with stakeholders. But then something shifted in her tone, something that everyone in the room picked up on immediately. She looked directly at Zohran and said, "Look, I understand that you people have concerns about these programs, but you have to understand the bigger picture here." Pause for effect, you people. The room went dead silent. Not the kind of silence you get when people are thinking about what was just said, but the kind of silence you get when everyone knows that something deeply inappropriate just happened and nobody knows quite how to respond out now. Nancy Mace would later claim that she meant you state legislators or you local politicians. But everyone in that room knew exactly what she meant. The phrase "you people" delivered with that particular tone, while looking at a young South Asian immigrant politician, carried unmistakable racial and cultural undertones. What happened? Next was going to depend entirely on how Zohran chose to respond. He could let it slide and continue with his questions. He could call out the inappropriate language and risk being labeled as oversensitive. He could get angry and play into stereotypes about emotional young politicians. Instead, he did something that no one in that room saw coming, something that would be talked about for months and studied by communication experts as a perfect example of how to respond to discrimination with intelligence and grace. Zohran Mamdani looked directly at Nancy Mace, paused for exactly 2 seconds, and delivered what would become one of the most quoted political responses in recent memory. "I'm sorry, which people am I exactly?" 7 words. That's all it took. But those 7 words were absolutely perfect. They weren't angry. They weren't accusatory. They weren't emotional. They were simply a request for clarification that forced Nancy Mace to confront exactly what she had just said. The beauty of Zohran's response was that it gave Nancy Mace every opportunity to clarify, to apologize, to walk back her comment, or to explain what she actually meant. Any experienced politician would have immediately recognized the escape route he was offering and taken it. Nancy Mace didn't take it. Instead, she doubled down. "You know what I mean," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "People like you who are always finding problems with everything we do. People like you." If her first comment had been arguably ambiguous, her second comment removed all doubt. She had just told a room full of politicians, journalists, and cameras that she viewed Zohran Mamdani as part of some other group that was fundamentally different from people like her. What happened next would determine whether this moment would be forgotten by tomorrow or remembered for years to come. And Zohran Mamdani was about to make sure it was remembered for all the right reasons. The response to Nancy Mace's double-down comment was immediate and devastating. Other committee members started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. You could see the moment when several of them realized they were witnessing something that was going to become a much bigger story than anyone had anticipated, but Zohran wasn't finished. His follow-up response was even more surgical than his first one. "Congresswoman Mace," he said, his voice calm and professional, I'm an elected representative asking legitimate policy questions based on documented evidence. If you're unable to engage with the substance of those questions, that's certainly your prerogative. But characterizing evidence-based policy discussions as finding problems with everything suggests either a misunderstanding of the legislative process or a reluctance to address documented disparities in federal programs. It was devastating. Professional, respectful, and absolutely devastating. He had just done something that most politicians never master. He had completely dismantled his opponent's position while maintaining the moral high ground. He hadn't accused her of racism directly, but he had forced her to confront the implications of her own words. Nancy Mace's response revealed just how unprepared she was for this level of political sophistication from someone she had clearly underestimated. Started to say something, stopped, started again, and then said, "I think we're getting off track here." Getting off track. That's how she characterized a moment where she had used racially coded language and then been called out on it. With surgical precision, the committee chair quickly moved on to the next questioner, but everyone in that room knew that what had just happened was going to be the story that came out of this hearing. And they were right that the video went viral for all the reasons that political content usually doesn't. It wasn't a gotcha moment or a cheap shot. It wasn't angry or emotional. It was simply a young politician responding to discrimination with intelligence, grace, and devastating effectiveness. Communication experts started analyzing Zohran's response almost immediately. They pointed out how he had managed to call out inappropriate behavior without losing his composure, how he had forced his opponent to clarify her position without making accusations, and how he had maintained his credibility while exposing hers. But the viral explosion wasn't just about the quality of Zohran's response. It was about what that response represented to millions of Americans who had experienced similar moments of dismissal, condescension, and coded racism. For young people of color, for immigrants, for anyone who had ever been told they were getting too uppity or reading too much into things, Zohran's response was a masterclass in how to stand up for yourself without giving your opponents ammunition to use against you. The hashtag which people started trending within 12 hours. People shared their own stories of being dismissed with phrases like "you people" or "people like you." The conversation expanded beyond the single incident to broader questions about respect, representation, and the way politicians talk to each other and to the communities they represent. Nancy Mace, meanwhile, was experiencing the other side of viral fame. And it wasn't pretty. Within 24 hours of the video going viral, Nancy Mace was in full damage control mode. But her response revealed just how little she understood about what had actually happened in that committee room. Her first statement, released through her congressional office, was a masterclass in how not to handle a public relations crisis. She claimed that her comments had been taken out of context and that she never intended any disrespect. The problem with that response was that the full context was available for everyone to see. There was no missing footage, no edited clips, no ambiguous circumstances. The entire exchange was captured on camera, and the context actually made her comments look worse, not better. Her second attempt at damage control was even more problematic. In an interview with a friendly media outlet, she suggested that Zohran had been looking for a confrontation and that he had twisted her words for political gain. This response revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually happened. Zohran hadn't twisted anything, he had simply asked for clarification. He hadn't looked for a confrontation, he had responded to one that she had initiated. The narrative that Nancy Mace was trying to create, that she was the victim of an unfair attack by an ambitious young politician, wasn't resonating with anyone. Who had actually watched the video. Her third attempt at damage control was perhaps the most telling. In a series of social media posts, she began attacking Zohran directly, questioning his qualifications, his experience, and his motives for grandstanding. During the hearing, what she didn't realize was that every attack she made was actually reinforcing the very pattern that Zohran had exposed in the first place, her tendency to dismiss, demean, and discredit rather than engage with substance. To understand why this exchange resonated so powerfully with so many people, you have to understand what it represented beyond just two politicians having a disagreement. This was a perfect encapsulation of generational change in American politics. On one side, you had Nancy Mace, representing an older style of politics where credentials and seniority were supposed to command automatic deference. On the other side, you had Zohran Mamdani, representing a new generation that refuses to accept dismissive treatment regardless of who's delivering it. But it was also about something deeper, the clash between two different understandings of what political discourse should look like. Nancy Mace's approach was based on hierarchy, deference, and the assumption that certain voices matter more than others. Zoran's approach was based on equality, substance, and the idea that good arguments deserve respect regardless of who makes them. For millions of Americans who have experienced similar moments being dismissed in meetings, having their expertise questioned because of their age or background, being told they're reading too much into obviously problematic behavior, Zohran's response was deeply validating. He had shown that it was possible to respond to discrimination without losing your professionalism. He had demonstrated that you could call out inappropriate behavior without being labeled as difficult or oversensitive. He had proven that intelligence and preparation could triumph over prejudice and condescension. But perhaps most importantly, he had shown that the old playbook, the one that Nancy Mace was using, simply doesn't work anymore. The idea that young politicians, politicians of color, or politicians from immigrant backgrounds should automatically defer to their betters is dying. And Zoran's response was both a symptom and a catalyst of that change. The broader implications of this moment were still playing out months later as other young politicians began adopting similar strategies for responding to dismissive treatment, and as older politicians began to realize that their traditional tactics were no longer effective. Political consequences of Nancy Mace's You People moment extended far beyond viral video fame. Within weeks, the incident was affecting real political outcomes and reshaping conversations about representation and respect in American politics. For Nancy Mace, the damage was immediate and lasting. Several upcoming speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Potential co-sponsors backed away from legislation she was promoting. Her carefully cultivated image as a reasonable Republican who could work across the aisle was severely damaged. But the political fallout wasn't just about one congresswoman's damaged reputation. The incident became a case study in political communication programs, a reference point in discussions about coded language and implicit bias, an example of how quickly political careers can be damaged by moments of revealed prejudice. Zohran Mamdani, the viral moment translated into real political capital. Donations to his political organization increased dramatically. Invitations to speak at events across the country started pouring in. National Democratic organizations began taking notice of the young assemblyman from Queens. But perhaps more importantly, Zohran's response became a template for other young politicians facing similar situations. Within months, there were documented cases of other elected officials using similar strategies, asking for clarification rather than making accusations, maintaining professionalism while exposing inappropriate behavior, and using their opponent's words against them. The incident also sparked broader conversations within both parties about the way politicians talk to each other, particularly across generational and cultural lines. Training programs began incorporating discussions of coded language and implicit bias. Senior politicians began receiving coaching on how to engage respectfully with younger colleagues. The long-term political implications were still being felt months later, as the incident continued to be referenced in discussions about political discourse, representation, and the changing dynamics of American politics. What can we learn from Zohran Mamdani's masterful response? How did he manage to turn a moment of discrimination into a viral victory that enhanced his reputation while damaging his opponents? First, preparation is everything. Zohran's ability to respond so effectively wasn't just natural talent. It was the result of years of experience dealing with similar situations and developing strategies for responding to them. He had clearly thought about how to handle dismissive treatment before he encountered it in that committee room. Second, staying calm under pressure is a superpower. Nancy Mace's entire strategy seemed designed to provoke an emotional response that would make Zohran look unprofessional or difficult. His calm, measured response completely neutralized that strategy while exposing her inappropriate behavior. Third, asking questions can be more powerful than making accusations. By asking which people am I exactly, Zohran forced Nancy Mace to confront her own words without giving her the opportunity to claim she was being unfairly attacked. Questions create clarity. Accusations create defensiveness. Fourth, maintaining the moral high ground is crucial. Throughout the exchange, Zohran never lost his professionalism, never resorted to personal attacks, and never gave his opponents ammunition to use against him. He let Nancy Mace's words speak for themselves while demonstrating his own character through his response. Fifth, substance beats seniority. Zohran's preparation, data, and legitimate policy questions ultimately carried more weight than Nancy Mace's congressional credentials and years of experience. In the modern political environment, what you know matters more than how long you've been around. Finally, sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is simply refusing to accept it. Zohran didn't get angry, he didn't get defensive, and he didn't back down. He simply insisted on being treated with the respect that any elected official deserves. And he did it in a way that was impossible to argue with. 6 months after Nancy Mace said, "You people," to Zohran Mamdani, the ripple effects of that moment were still being felt throughout American politics. The incident had become more than just a viral video or a political embarrassment. It had become a symbol of generational change, an example of effective political communication, and a reference point for discussions about respect and representation in government. Political science professors were using the exchange in their classes as an example of how language reveals underlying attitudes and how skilled politicians can expose those attitudes without resorting to personal attacks. Communication consultants were studying Zohran's response as a masterclass in crisis, communication, and strategic thinking under pressure. His ability to turn a moment of attack into a moment of triumph had become a case study in political effectiveness. Beyond the world of politics, the phrase, "which people am I exactly?" had entered popular culture as a way of calling out coded language and implicit bias. People were using it in workplace situations, in social media discussions, and in everyday conversations when they encountered similar, dismissive treatment. The legacy of those 7 words wasn't just about one political exchange or one viral moment. It was about proving that intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking could triumph over prejudice and condescension. It was about showing that it was possible to stand up for yourself and your community without losing your dignity or your effectiveness. And perhaps most importantly, it was about demonstrating that in American politics, substance still matters more than seniority, and respect still has to be earned rather than simply demanded. 7 words. I'm sorry, which people am I exactly? That's all it took to expose prejudice, demonstrate grace under pressure, and show millions of Americans that it's possible to respond to discrimination with intelligence and effectiveness. Zohran Mamdani didn't just win a political exchange that day, he provided a template for how to handle similar situations with dignity and power. And Nancy Mace didn't just lose a political exchange, she revealed attitudes and behaviors that ultimately damaged her credibility and her career. In a political environment often dominated by anger, accusations, and personal attacks. Zoran's response reminded us that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply asking the right question at the right moment. What did you think of Zohran Mamdani's response? Have you ever had to deal with similar dismissive treatment? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more analysis of political moments that changed everything, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.